Welcome to today's webinar, Our Brains on Technology, a Risky Combo for Drivers, hosted by the National Safety Council, a leading advocate for safety in the United States. There is no safe way to use a cell phone and drive, even when using a hands-free device, because our brain remains distracted. With 1 in 4 crashes estimated to involve cell phone use, we are glad you've registered for this unique and exciting webinar. A few housekeeping matters before we begin. If you experience any problems during the presentation, please contact technical support at 1-877-297-2901. A bit later, we will welcome your questions and comments during the presentation. You may submit questions electronically by typing them into the chat pod located in the lower left corner of your screen. Questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. The link to the recording and slides from today's presentation will be emailed to all attendees. Now I'll share a little bit about our presenters. Matt Richtel reports for the New York Times covering technology and telecommunications. In 2010, he won the Pulitzer Prize for national reporting for his series of articles on the hazardous use of cell phones, computers, and other devices while operating cars and trucks, which stimulated widespread efforts to curb distracted driving. Matt grew up in Boulder, Colorado, and obtained a bachelor's degree in rhetoric from the University of California at Berkeley and an MS in journalism from Columbia University. He is the author of 4 novels, including most recently The Cloud and the forthcoming The Doomsday Equation. Dr. Paul Atchley is Professor of Psychology and an Associate Dean of Online and Professional Education at the University of Kansas. He has been conducting research and teaching about cognitive factors related to driving for over 20 years. Dr. Atchley received his PhD from the University of California, Riverside in 1996 and completed postdoctoral training at the Beckman Institute at the University of Illinois in 1998. He is currently on faculty at the University of Kansas and has been since 1998. Dr. Atchley has published numerous peer-reviewed articles and chapters on issues of vision and attention, including their relationship to driving. Dr. Atchley's work has been highlighted by national and international press, including the BBC, Car Talk, NPR, Rock Center Katie with Katie Couric, and the New York Times. He was most recently featured in Matt Richtel's book, A Deadly Wandering. Welcome.
Good to be here.
Good to be here. Is this our cue to take over?
I think that's you, Matt.
Okay, here I go. Everybody, I want to welcome you, and I want to say that this is such an appropriate beginning because oftentimes Paul and I both get accused of being Luddites and anti-technology and of trying to destroy all of Silicon Valley with our warnings and admonitions. And so far from it is the truth. And this moment shows why. This is not a screed against technology. If it were not for technology, we could not be joining all of you. Paul, you are ensconced somewhere in Kansas, is that right?
That's right. I'm in my office here in the Dean Suite.
He's in the Dean Suite, and I am in a home office in sunny and drought-filled California. So just so you guys know listening, this is not, to put a fine point on it, a screed against technology. We are enabled in so many ways. What this is an explanation of our relationship to technology. And I just want to start, this is the book that I wrote that outlines many of these issues, and Paul was instrumental in it. If you're interested in hearing more, A Deadly Wandering. But I just want to start with a question, which is, and you obviously can't raise hands. Ordinarily in front of an audience, I ask the question, have you ever been in a bad relationship? So just, I'm imagining that none of you are raising your hands because you're all too shy to admit it. But I'm going to posit today, and I think Paul and I will both explain why, there is a reasonable chance that you are in a bad relationship with your phone. It is a relationship in which your phone just like the needy and domineering boyfriend or girlfriend you had in college or high school before you met your wonderful spouse. It has much more power than you realize. And the reason that it has much more power than you realize is because it is playing to deep, primitive wiring and social instincts. And why do I mention that in the context of this conversation with driving? The reason I mention it is that as we form policy as a nation, as policymakers, as legislators, and as we form policy within our families, we need to understand what the research says about our relationship to the phone. It is, in many ways, unlike any relationship we've ever had with any other thing external to us. And until we realize the extent to which it plays to these primitive instincts, we can't make good decisions. Are we addicted? Paul and I will answer that question by the end of this call. All right, I first want to start by explaining something. You can see this slide. Paul, let me just ask you, because you're seeing the slides as, do you see, is everybody seeing this slide with 84.4%? Do you see that, Paul?
I've got that, yep.
You've got that. Okay, look, there is a massive disconnect right now in society between what we say are the risks with our phones and how we actually behave. What we say is, and this is, I believe, from AAA Foundation for Traffic Safety, 84.4% say texting and driving is a serious issue, tantamount to drunk driving. But I believe the number, I can't actually see it as easily. I think it's near 30% say, here we go, next slide. Near 30%, 36% have read a text, 27% have sent one. I suspect, Paul, you suspect those numbers are low?
It depends on who you're asking. I can tell you here at the University of Kansas, and this isn't Silicon Valley, but we have a lot of kids that like technology and they drive. They report 97% of the time, 97% of our students report that they text and drive, and they've done it on average about 14 times in the last week. And asking those folks how bad it is, they will tell you it's worse than drunk driving. So
okay,
it's exactly the same setup, same punchline.
Same setup, same punchline, massive disconnect. I'll just ask the audience to think about this. When I tried to figure out a disconnect that was that large between professed attitudes and actual behaviors, the only other example I could find of a gap that large was smoking. And you know why people smoke. They smoke. They say it's the worst thing I can do. I can't help myself. They smoke because they're addicted. Is there a parallel here? Before we go on, I just want to say that if you haven't seen the most recent study that really puts a fine point on this, again, this came out about 2 weeks ago from the AAA Foundation for Traffic Safety. Go look up the videos, and they will show you these 1,700 crashes. They'll show you some of them of teen drivers. Fine point to put on this. This is not just teen drivers we're talking about. Their brains are a little bit different in ways that Paul and I will discuss in a minute, but this is hardly a function of teen drivers. This is parents, this is your employees, this is you. But if you want to go see some startling video, watch the extent to which young people get lost in their devices and then, boom, into these terrible wrecks.
Now, I want to touch on that slide really quickly, if you don't mind, Matt. And one thing people need to keep in mind, these are videos of drivers who knew that their parents were going to watch the videos. So when we look at these percentages, I am absolutely convinced that these are massive underestimates, because most of these kids knew when they picked up that cell phone that their parents would see their video of them picking up a cell phone.
Right. You guys, think about what, here's Paul, here to put another fine point on what Paul's saying. There was a video camera in the car, and what they were doing was illegal, and what they were doing was dangerous to the point of causing people to die, and they did it anyway. That's how powerful the lure. And so let's get into this right now. Paul and I are going to take you inside the brain, and to do this, again, a fun little exercise if you like using your imagination. I want you to picture a cave person, your forebear. So the idea here is if you're sitting there, try to avoid looking at your email, try to avoid FaceTiming right now. Engage us with this exercise. I promise you will find it useful. Picture your forebear, so this is you but a lot hairier, tending to a fire. And as you are tending to the fire, your forebear is tending to the fire, your forebear gets a tap on the shoulder from behind. And I would ask you if we were all live together, but I'll ask Paul. Paul, can the cave person avoid turning around to see who has tapped him or her on the shoulder?
Not if his brain's functioning properly, he can't.
And why not?
Because and there's nothing more important than physical contact, and if it's a tap on the shoulder, it tells you that's probably someone I know and it's important.
It could be opportunity, it could be threat, it could be a potential mate, it could be someone warning you of a volcano eruption, it could be someone with a spear. You have got to turn around. Now, let me draw another connection. So there you are in the car, and you're driving, and you hear the phone ring. This is a proverbial tap on the shoulder from anyone anywhere in the world, but as Paul says, it may well be someone you know, and that puts enormous pressure on you to turn around just like the cave person. Let's take you inside the brain. Okay. The purple part on these, Paul, can you just tell us about the purple part here and what part of the brain that is?
Right. So these are scans. Well, they're anatomical images, basically showing this area we call the prefrontal cortex. I just usually describe it as the thing that really makes us most human, given what it's responsible for, which we're going to get into: emotions, inhibition, keeping track of rules. The thing about the prefrontal cortex in the human is it's probably the most sophisticated part of our brain. It's the last thing to get wired. It doesn't get wired in young women until they're 23, young men 25, which is why young men do stupid things longer. And it's the first thing to go. We give people cognitive tests when they have age-related declines, and those cognitive tests generally are to spot changes in this region of the brain because it's so important.
So if you guys are there on just do yourself this little exercise, tap on your forehead, that's where your prefrontal cortex is. What does this have to do with the cave person? Essentially, and oversimplifying a bit, when the cave person is tending to the fire, that person is using that part of the brain. It's a very sophisticated part of the brain involved in focus and attention. When the tap comes on the shoulder, or the cave person hears the roar of a lion, that sends a signal. Now, tap, essentially, I'm oversimplifying here, but the bottom part of the brain, it's a kind of place that is much less uniquely human, and we share with reptiles. It sends a signal: lion, run or die. And can you just tell us, Paul, a little bit about that lower region of the brain and why it's important?
Right. Some people may have read about this if they've heard of System 1 versus System 2, thinking that the Kahneman idea. That area of the brain, this emotional decision-making area, the one we share with folks with lizards and such, is a very quick system. It's a system that essentially gives us very few decisions, fight or flight, and it generally is very capable of kind of hijacking our behaviors even when we know better. The other system, that prefrontal system, this system 2, is slower, more thoughtful, and generally comes online long after this emotional decision-making system has taken effect. So when that lion roars, that system hijacks us, hijacks our body, gets the blood flowing, the heart pumping, and gets us ready for activity, whereas it may take the prefrontal cortex a little bit longer to realize, oh, those are just some friends of mine playing a joke. There's no real lion out there.
So putting that another way, essentially what Paul is saying, I mean, these are words I borrowed from him in the book A Deadly Wandering. Your brain will get hijacked, the front part of your brain. It has to, and here's why. This next slide is what happens when you have too much time to surf the internet while you're putting together a PowerPoint. Here's why. is if the cave person doesn't pay attention to the sound, they get what is that? You're the scientist, Paul. What is that on the guy's head?
I have no idea. Big bug.
You get a no idea on your head. But you can see why it is so significant that we respond and even necessary to that proverbial tap on the shoulder, because in a primitive sense, it could be something really scary, like the I don't know on your head. Before I go further in explaining, and we go further about the technology, I'm going to, and what it's doing to our brain, I want to answer a basic question, and Paul is just steeped in this, but Paul, will you be my guinea pig?
Sure, I'll try it.
Okay, so look, you might have a question. Well, why can't we do two things at once? And this could fall into any number of two things, like listen to the front part of the brain and the back part of the brain, or drive and talk on the phone. Most people know that multitasking is a myth. Understand that, but there's a simple exercise put together by David Strayer, one of the terrific people on this issue, and I'm going to just ask Paul to go along with me. Paul, will you recite the letters A to I as fast as you can?
Right, and I must give a disclaimer. I do this at my own talk, so if anyone can do this task, it should be me. I will try to recite as quickly as possible. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L. Oops. Well, I got to I. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I. Stop.
See, think about this, you guys. He's in the dean's office, and he still doesn't know the alphabet.
Well, I know too much of it, apparently. And the numbers, 1 to 9. Are you ready? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. All right.
Okay, that's the setup. Before I explain, so he's done two independent tasks. Now he's going to try to do two tasks at once, which is recite A and then 1, B and then 2, all the way up. All right. So each of those took, I would say, less than 2 seconds. Go for it.
I always pick on other people for this. Let's see if I can do it. All right, here we go. A1, B2, C3, D4, E5, F6, G7, H8, I9. There we go. That's actually
Paul,
not too bad.
Can you explain to us? What that simple exercise has showed us, and what's happening in the brain there?
Right. It actually shows a couple things. I'm fairly practiced at it, and so I was able to get a little bit further than most people do. But even with practice, there's really no way to switch between different tasks effectively. This is an example we use when we talk about multitasking, because we don't really multitask, we task switch. Our brain is not a parallel processor. It can only do one thing at a time. It looks like it's in parallel sometimes because we can go back and forth between things really, really rapidly without conscious awareness. But at the end of the day, the brain is a set of circuits that really only does any two things that requires attention in sequence. So in this task, when I did one task, just reciting the letters, my prefrontal cortex only had to keep track of one rule, letters. And when I did numbers, the same thing. When I did the switching version, my brain had to keep track of two sets of rules. And what I had to do was remember, okay, now I'm on a number, and I need to now switch to a letter and then access my memory system to see what letter I had been on previously and say the next letter in that sequence is X. And as over time you heard me get slower because that switching cost started to stack up.
Okay, so now you can just see this simple exercise, and if you want to do it with your kids, your employees, whatever, you can begin to see the costs. Let me ground this for a moment in the question at hand, driving, before we move on to explaining more about the brain and its relationship with the device, and why it is so critical that, or why we are putting ourselves in a position to have to switch more than we can. Let me just ground this. Paul mentioned something really, really important. He mentioned that there was a cost, a moment where he has to switch tracks, even on this simple task. Most of the time when you are driving, it seems like a simple task. But in those crucial instances where a millisecond or a second or 2 seconds dictates whether you will live or die, whether you will paralyze yourself or someone else, whether you will kill someone else, the act of switching takes longer than you're able to do it. So just bear in mind bear in mind, if you're saying to yourself, gosh, so many times I've gotten away with this, what Paul demonstrated as he got farther in this thing was it took time to switch. If it takes time to switch and you're piloting a missile, someone can die. Okay,
right.
now
let me add one thing to that, Matt, if you don't mind, too, because the point Matt making is extremely important. It takes conscious effort to be able to drive safely. You know, we can just pilot the missile fairly automatically, but scanning the environment, detecting threat, that takes mental effort and attention. The thing that's really fools people, though, is not the driving part necessarily, but the language part, because we all think we're so good at it because we're extremely practiced. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that our brain uses more power to process language than any other thing that it does. Language is the last thing to get programmed. It's generally the first thing to go as we get older. And so our brain, when it's processing language, listening and speaking, is engaged in an incredibly complex task, and one that generally grabs as much of the resources as it possibly can, which means there's less left over for other things like paying attention to the world around you.
Okay, great. So what we've done, just to ground everybody and me and Paul at this point, is we've explained that there's a primitive that we can't do two things at once, and that is one category here. Set it aside for a second. The other, and we're going to build on it right now, is why the devices are so alluring that it gets hard to ignore the ping, or even to initiate a call. Surprisingly, that also has its own addictive quality. The first thing we've told you is that there's a mechanical impulse. To build on that, the mechanical impulse to respond to the proverbial tap. The next thing I want to show you, and this slide should come up, is really significant, and it has to do with the nature of the information. It is social information. You can see on the screen the amount of social information. I'm going to ask Paul to comment on this in a second, but I just want to explain something about, so you've got a tap on the shoulder that's almost a mechanical act, but it's also the knowledge on a primitive level that it's social information. How important is social information? It is important on the deepest level, and I'll ask you to go back to the cave person again. If Paul was a cave person and put his hand in the fire and got burned and got an infection and would then therefore die from it, if he couldn't tell me that fire burned, I would have to go through the same exercise, and quite literally the species would be done. Social communication is at least one of the most powerful adaptive things we've got, and maybe encoded into our DNA. And so look at the number of messages coming every single day. Social information is some of the most salient, important information that we've got. And I think you can, Paul, do you want to just talk a little bit about that, or do you want to save that for later when we get into the economics?
Right. We can talk a little bit later, but I'll do the reverse, because I think people get overwhelmed by these kinds of numbers sometimes. But let's think about social information in the opposite, not being socially connected. That's not considered to be healthy. When people withdraw, when they become depressed, they lose those social connections, and that is a sign of mental illness. So in other words, to be a healthy human means to be connected and to care about those things. And when we don't care about those things and we aren't connected, that's a sign that we're not healthy anymore. It just shows that our brain is really built to value this kind of thing.
So now we've got two things. We've got the mechanics, we've got the social information. I'm now going to tell you one of my favorite things of trivia, medical trivia. It's not trivial, but it is a fascinating thing that has to do with why our brains are so drawn to our devices. Yay, we get to say the word spam. Listen, you would think that if your device delivered you a lot of crud, a lot of meaningless messages, a lot of worthless information, that it would condition you to respond to it less. Perversely and curiously, you respond to your device more when it gives you cruddy stuff, and the reason for that is that when you don't know when the good one's going to come, you answer it all the time hoping for the jackpot. if you will, let's go back to, many of you have likely heard of B.F. Skinner, and he did remarkable psychology in the middle of the early part of last century. Paul will correct me if I've got this wrong.
Close enough.
Close enough. Close enough. That's what we're shooting for. That's why, thank God he's in Kansas. I can't see the dirty look. And he had a rat in a cage. And essentially, and I'll simplify the experiment, the rat never knows which press of the lever is going to bring food. And so the rat constantly is pressing the lever. This is a kind of lure called intermittent reinforcement. And Paul, can you just talk about how powerful is the lure of intermittent reinforcement?
It's the best way to train an animal for a behavior that will exist over the long term, that won't extinguish. Because if the organism never knows when that press is going to result in a reward, but every once in a while it does, they will be able to persevere on through all the instances where that behavior is not resulting in the reward. The worst thing you can do for training your dog, as an example, is give them a cookie every single time they do something, because they'll figure out really quickly when you stop giving them cookies that that behavior is not necessary anymore. So intermittent reinforcement, as you'll talk about in your next slide, is the way that we get all sorts of behaviors to persist and also create some very unhealthy ones.
Yeah, I mean, this is, as Paul's alluding to, this is the slot machine. So it's the same thing sitting in Vegas. There you are in your car. You've already got the mechanical impulse to respond. You know, it may be social information, and perversely on top of that, even though you've been conditioned that most of it is spam, that makes it more alluring. Okay, so now we're going to start to add these things up, and you're going to see where we're headed here. Let us go to, okay. Paul, can you talk a little bit about, right now everybody who's listening, we're going to talk about the neurochemical dopamine. And you've probably heard this in the context to some extent of the phone, but Paul, can you talk a little bit about dopamine here and what it is broadly?
Yeah, the joke, if you're a neuroscientist, is that there's really only two things that you love. You think you love your spouse, you think you love chocolate, but you really only love serotonin and dopamine, the reward chemicals that are associated with those things. When it comes right down to it, our brain dictates what we find interesting or not interesting. And when we find something interesting, enjoyable, and our brain wants us to continue to interact with it or eat it or have a relationship with it, our brain releases this chemical reward called dopamine to encourage us to engage with it a second time. The example I like to use is when I talk to an audience is I ask, who out there likes folding laundry? And there's always one person and everyone else just looks around like that person's crazy. But then I ask, and I'll ask the audience out there, I just want you to think to yourself, when you last folded a basket of laundry, when you were done, give me one word that would describe how you feel, how you felt at that moment. And I think for the majority of the folks, that word was probably something along the lines of achievement. I felt good, right? You felt like you accomplished something. And that's your brain giving you a little rush of dopamine to encourage you to engage in that, frankly, very boring behavior the next time, because that's a task that needs to get done. The thing with dopamine,
let me pause you right there and say, what does this have to do with what we're talking about? Well, this is what I'm going to tell you now is very it's fairly early science that a bunch of folks are stitching together. But bear in mind, this is often how science is done. Inferences are made from a bunch of information, and in this case, and a bunch of studies, the leading edge scientists seem to see on neuroimaging studies and neurochemical studies that when you interact with your device, you get a little burst of dopamine, a little rush of reward, and it's happening when we interact with our devices. And I'll just give you guys, if you can think about it in the audience, when you get a little buzz on your phone and you feel a little rush, it's fair to posit that that's a little burst of dopamine. You know when you feel the urge to check your phone and you haven't for a while, that might be an urge for a little burst of dopamine. And what the cycle that the leading edge scientists are positing now, hypothesizing, this is yet to be proven completely, but is that when you interact with your device, you get a burst of dopamine. When you interact, you get a burst of dopamine. When you interact, you get a burst of dopamine. And then when you don't, you begin to feel bored. It is a very kind of mini withdrawal, and so what do? You go get some more. And I will read you this quote that appears in A Deadly Wandering. This is, you can read it yourselves, but this is from David Greenfield, who Paul actually introduced me to. He teaches the only class in a medical school on internet addiction. He says, you see the computer, it's one trigger. Then you sit at the keyboard, it's another. You push the key, you get a result. There's a cascade of dopamine. It's the big kahuna. And then he said, it's in a sense a narcotic.
Yep.
So
and let me add something to that, Matt, because
yep.
and I want to take you back to the rat and over half a century, more than half a century of behaviorist work. The thing with rewards is you have what are often called second-order rewards. In other words, think about money. Money itself, the little green thing, is not rewarding, but what you can do with it is extremely rewarding. So we're willing to sit in an office and engage in behaviors so we can get the promise of that green thing to actually get us something that we want. The phone itself doesn't have to actually give us a reward, but the phone is associated with things that do give us rewards. So when that buzz goes off, the buzz by itself is not particularly rewarding. On the other hand, the promise of being able to have contact with someone that you care about, or to learn something about someone else's day, or the big kahuna, to actually tell someone else something about yourself, think about how Facebook works, that is dopamine. That will give dopamine.
I'm glad that's perfect segue. And what Paul is getting at is what this slide says. Really interesting. Up till now, Paul and I have been talking about getting information. But we now have research, as you'll see in this slide, and I believe that shows, Paul, this is what you're getting at, right? The sharing of information gives you a dopamine rush.
That's
right.
Is that right?
Yeah,
and in this particular study, what the researchers were doing brain scans of regions that light up when dopamine is being released, and they had people just talking to other folks about the weather. But then they had folks talk about their own opinions or something about their day, or Instagram their breakfast. When you're disclosing something about yourself to someone else, that is probably your greatest opportunity to make yourself feel good. Your brain just lights up like a Christmas tree in the reward networks.
So I'm going to ground us again. I want to keep doing it. You guys on the listening are saying, this is a lot of neuroscientists. What does this neuroscience? What does this have to do with driving? The picture we are painting for you has everything to do with driving. It has everything to do with policy. It has everything to do with your family and employee behaviors. And it has everything to do not just with the car, but your relationship with the device outside of the car. Because until we understand, until we get clear on what our relationship is with our device, we can't make good decisions. And we're getting close to answering the question in this conversation. I suspect Paul and I might even disagree on this about whether it's addictive such that we can't put our phones down even if we want to. Let me go next to a study, a last little point we're going to add up before we add all this up for you. A study that Paul himself did and is expert in, and this has to do with the piece of the social pressure we feel to stay connected on top of everything else. Paul, can you tell us in the simplest way about the very complicated thing, neuroeconomics, and what you've learned?
Yeah, one of the ways to understand addiction is instead of asking, does this interfere with your life, you essentially ask someone to not take that reward and see how long they can do it. So think about someone who's addicted to alcohol, and you can tell if they're addicted to alcohol because they just can't quit. And by looking at how long they're able to withhold, you get a sense of how invested they are. We did a study where we assessed how long people were willing to put off monetary rewards, and we assessed how long those rewards would kind of decay. And so in the bottom line world, an undergraduate can put off a monetary reward. If I'm going to give them $100, they're willing to put off getting that $100 for a couple of weeks. if I say the alternative is I give you $75 now. So it loses a quarter of its value after 2 weeks. All we did in that study is we just added information to that equation. We said, how long would you be willing to wait off getting that $100 if you also knew that you had an opportunity to text your girlfriend back who had just sent you a text message? And when we did it that way, people were only willing to put off, instead of weeks getting that monetary reward, minutes, because they couldn't imagine not responding to that informational prompt that they were getting from someone that they knew very, very well.
Paul, can I just
Go ahead, Matt.
put a fine point on
I was going to say, information loses value quickly in a way that nothing else does. And so people feel very compelled, and I think some people feel addicted, in a way that prevents them from being able to treat it in a rational way.
In other words, they're willing. Information becomes more valuable in a sense than money, at least to the group, in a certain way of measuring it, to the group that Paul studied. And I want to tell you something Paul said to me as we were driving, when I was reporting the book, as we were driving through Kansas, and he really nailed it for me. He said, look, if I'm 19 years old and my text goes off and I don't check it for 20 minutes, and I drove 20 minutes away from the party that someone said was going on, I'm going to be really frustrated. So you can see in that sort of simple, eloquent example why there feels such pressure. Do you want to add to that, Paul, before I go to the next question?
Yeah, I'd say for the people that are on the webinar here, instead of that party, think about your unwillingness to not pay attention to email for some period of time because you're worried that there's going to be an email that comes in about something related to your job and your work social network that you're going to miss. And if you miss it, you're going to be left out and there's going to be a problem. I think everyone probably on the webinar can relate to that.
Paul's going to talk a little bit about productivity in a bit. Before we do, I want to just do a public service announcement. We are taking questions. If you do not bring your own questions, we will bring questions for you, but we hope you do. I invariably find that once people start to feel the courage to ask questions, they just start to flow. So please do send them in. We're going to save time at the end to do that. Okay, let me add up what we've got here. We just mentioned it. We've got the tap on the shoulder, the intermittent reinforcement, the social value, the dopamine squirt, what Paul just mentioned. I'm going to give you one analogy that is often, what is a PowerPoint presentation? You can't really have one by law without a Simpsons reference, I think.
I think that's right.
Is that right, Paul?
Even in academia, yeah, that's correct.
Especially in academia. So look, I want to tell you what I think this adds up to, and when I say I think, this is drawn from lots of reporting with lots of brilliant people like Paul, so this is not my surmise, but really listening to all these folks. When we industrialized food as a world, lots of amazing things happened. If you'll journey with me for just about 30 seconds. We created more calories for more people. We packaged and created things that we could ship. We fed areas that could have otherwise gone hungry. Now, there's lots of issues with industrialization of food. Let's set those aside for a second. The only issue I want to play on right now is we also began to figure out how to create foods with enormous sugar and fat content to simulate the tastiest morsel you could ever have found as that cave person. And it was only a vending machine away. And what happened as a result was obesity and lots of other problems associated with it, and diabetes, and go down the list, and heart problems. In effect, we created this thing that was so important on a primitive level, feeding ourselves, but also got to the heart of and engineered a way to appeal to some of our darker instincts, eating sugar and fat, having it be very accessible. The analogy here is to the phone. It is a lifeblood today for communications and beyond, and business and commerce, the way food is. There is no doubt. While it is not as immediately necessary as food, it is essential to getting your job done, to communicating with your family. But in the same way that food is preying on some darker primitive instincts, the phone can play to these darker primitive instincts in the car under the most dangerous, damaging, deadly circumstances. And this is the quote I just find so, this appears deep in the book, and is poached from it, but I think I'm allowed to poach my own material. The cell phone meets a deep need for social connection with a greater ease and greater potential detriment to do it, in the same way that a vending machine that is right down the hall plays to our need for calories. So I'm going to full stop here and just say, before we move to something, to really bringing this into the car full circle, what you're looking at is a device that is so wonderful but is so alluring and so habit-forming as to be almost impossible to ignore. And if that's the case, and if it is also the case that you cannot do two things at once, the car plus the phone is an extremely, extremely dangerous combination. Paul, I want to ask you a punchline question that I think there's some disagreement about, but deserves to be asked if someone doesn't ask it. Is the phone addictive, habit-forming, has addictive properties? What is the proper way to think about it today?
Yeah, I would say that communication is addictive. As I pointed out, if you don't communicate, it's not healthy. And the phone just gives us the ability to communicate on a massive level. But as someone who grew up in Silicon Valley, let me put it this way. Designers are specifically building these devices to attract attention. Most people don't realize it, but one of the reasons that companies like Google are so successful is because they're mining all of your data to use for marketing decisions and other kinds of things, and they're doing it by essentially putting out an extremely attractive and useful product. These things are being designed by very smart people, some of them cognitive psychologists like me, in order to hijack your brain for the specific purposes of getting that little slice of your attention, that very limited resource. So yes, they are hard to ignore. To answer the question of someone on the phone, what should I do about this? It sounds like someone says, sounds like the safest way to drive is to either leave your cell phone at home or to power it off so that I don't get that buzz. I would say yes. Even knowing what I know when I drive, either the phone someplace I can't access it, like in the trunk or in my bag someplace I can't reach it, or if I'm having to use it to navigate, I put it in Do Not Disturb mode so that no one can contact me, because I know, even though I know what I know as a scientist, that if that phone goes off, I can't resist the siren song of it in that distracted state.
So without actually having a clear and total answer to is it addicting, does it have addictive properties, is it habit forming, I think it's right up, at least butting up against the line of addictive. But I want to tell you something else here that Paul has helped me, and this goes to some of the questions that are coming in. I want to thank you for them. Now we're going to have time to get to them even as we go through the last few slides. There is a fascinating thing that Paul alerted me to, and I've subsequently learned much more about. One of us can talk about the chocolate cake study. Maybe, Paul, you can. Let me tee it up.
Yep.
When you are driving, part of your brain is a significant part of your brain, even if you feel like you are on autopilot, no pun intended, is involved in the task of driving. And when that happens, some of your decision-making power is absorbed by the task of driving. And what that means is it gets harder to make a rational decision about answering the phone because your brain, your decision-making power is consumed. Paul, would you mind telling us about, I love this study, you guys listening, the chocolate cake study and what we're talking about here?
Sure, and there was a great question that leads into this. Someone says, thanks for all the neurochemistry. Does this mean we'd have to rewire driver's association with the devices? What I think it means is we have to take a kind of page from sort of behavioral training, and we have to understand when we're sort of limited in our decision making and when we have the best capacity to make a decision. I would argue the best capacity to make a decision about this is before you get in the vehicle, the chocolate cake study. So marketers, because again, they're trying to figure out how to hijack your brain, did a brilliant little study where they they essentially said, okay, we're going to bring a group of folks in, and for some of those folks, we're going to tax their prefrontal cortex, that's system 2 for the person asking the question, that little slower rational system. We're going to tax their prefrontal cortex very simply by having them memorize a 7-digit number. We're going to have another group that's going to be fairly untaxed. They're going to memorize a 2-digit number. And what they did, unbeknownst to the participants, they said, we're going to walk down the hallway, we're going to go and do this test in another room. Midway down the hallway, there would be a cart, and on that cart there would be some fruit and some chocolate cake. Now, all of us thinking fruit and chocolate cake at this time of the day are probably thinking, chocolate cake, right? But we know we should eat the fruit. What they found was they said, go ahead and just keep memorizing, but check off on this form which one you would like later. What they found was the people that had their system 2, that prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain that's responsible for inhibiting bad behaviors, taxed simply by memorizing a 7-digit number, picked the chocolate cake, made the bad decision 50% more often. I'll say that one more time. The people that have their prefrontal cortex taxed made a bad decision 50% more often. To translate this to the car, when you're driving is an extremely complicated task, requires a lot of your brain to pay attention, to orient attention, to understand the rules, to know where you are, to navigate. You're using a huge portion of your brain that is also responsible for making good decisions and inhibiting bad ones. One of the reasons teen drivers don't drive as safely, because they lack inhibitory control. When you are driving and you lack that inhibitory control, you now lack the ability to then ignore something that is constructed and built to be extremely attractive to your brain in another way, that social device.
That's great, Paul. So let me just interrupt and say, let me just, to try to make these things discrete, we've told you why the phone is so alluring. We've told you how you can't do two things at once. What Paul is really underscoring here beautifully is that even without all of that stuff, it gets hard to make a good decision. He is proposing, as some have asked here, there's been some terrific questions coming in, and we'll get to some more of them as we go with the next slide, is that you better turn it off ahead of time, because you can't make a decision. It gets very, very, very hard to make a decision, even for Paul and I, and we study this stuff all the time. There's been some questions about the current car. And what has put us in this position to begin with? I believe this is the Tesla.
Mm-hmm.
I think people have described that as a 17-inch iPod screen. You know, let's talk about where the pressures are coming inside the car and societally. At one time, the way that you may recall that this was called a car phone. The reason it was called a car phone largely was because phone companies built the devices initially for the car. They put their first towers up on the highways, the first cell phone towers. Why? Well, quite simply, it was the only place you couldn't talk on the phone. That was where the market niche was. Now, over time, the phone companies have gotten a little bit of religion on this, and for the quite simple let me not put words in their mouth. One reason may well be because they no longer make money by the minute talking, when people talk. Remember those exorbitant minute-per-minute charges when you talk in the car? Those are gone. They sell in buckets. They don't particularly care if you're on the phone when you're driving. In fact, they may argue that they'd rather not have you on the phone because those are high-traffic times. But who makes money now when you're connected in the car? Well, to some extent, it's the automakers. They think that using a similar rationale, that this is a place you don't have what they call infotainment. Paul, can you talk a little bit about what we know about some of this in-car technology?
Yeah, and maybe I'll try to do it in a way that will answer some of these questions, because we've had some really good questions about what do professional drivers do. There's a question about police officers using laptops, and when you're looking at this display, what you see is a display of vehicle information, the temperature of the car, et cetera, as well as map information. I would argue that what you have to do is look at things in terms of a cost-benefit analysis. When someone's using an in-car navigation system, does it require attention to use that system? Yes. But I would argue that a well-designed system uses less attention than the equivalent of someone reading a physical map, trying to read a set of directions they wrote down on a piece of paper, getting directions from a passenger who may not know how to navigate. So technology can provide us with the ability to do tasks related to driving much more safely. if you're a police officer and you are using a laptop to run a suspect's license plate prior to going after that suspect's car, and when you're pulling them over, that might save your life because that person might be wanted. If you are a fire chief and you're speeding to the scene of a fire in order to put a fire out at the same time getting directions, that's a risk, but the risk of the building burning down is more. So we have to look at things in terms of a balance. Where I have a problem is when devices in the vehicle are essentially giving us what I would argue is largely worthless information. When we look at what people are actually texting about or talking about during these drives, it's inane. We have yet to run into a report from someone who gave us information on what they were texting about during that previous week where they're texting and driving 14 times. Where anyone sitting in this webinar would agree that was probably a good use of their time. They're mostly status updates. They're passengers. They're them just being bored. They're trying to tell someone, I'm going to be there in 5 minutes, when 5 minutes from now they would have figured that out. And I play a little game with my students asking them to come up with scenarios where using that device in the car actually would be a net gain to safety, and no one's ever successfully completed it.
And just to, let me just show you on this last slide, and then we'll just all talk questions. To Paul's point about whether the technology is solving things, this is some more research out of the University of Utah, and what it does is show the distraction, what is happening inside the brain, and what is the distraction caused by various technologies. And on the far right, you can see a huge neurological load from something called the OSSPAN test. Paul, do you know what that is?
It's Operation Span. It's a test no one ever wants to do because it's designed to really push you and tax you mentally. I hate it.
Okay, so it's basically impossible juggling act.
Yeah.
But the technology that is professed as the savior here is talk to text. And what the researchers have discovered is that takes an enormous amount of power, partly brain power, partly because, as some researchers have put it to me, you wind up arguing with your phone. You say, what are directions to Paul's house? And you wind up getting a pizza, the directions to a pizza place.
Right. Let me add something to that, Matt. Again, this dovetails with the question someone had about passenger, and that's on there. These are mental workload ratings for one particular type of car in one study, and they vary. But the question was, what about talking to a passenger? Is that a problem too? Yes, that adds mental workload. But I think everyone on this webinar has had the experience of driving a car with a passenger who is an experienced driver themselves, going into traffic, and then suddenly the conversation stops. Because in that instance, both people are aware of how demanding the driving task is, and they're aware that the conversation is taking resources away from the primary task. It's one of the reasons we don't like having a lot of teens driving together, because they tend to not stop. And when we look at cell phone conversations, we find that those conversations always maintain the same level of conversational complexity, and they tend to be more complex than in-car conversations, regardless of what's going on in the drive around the person. So we know implicitly as drivers and as passengers that talking takes resources, but we can make choices in a way that we often don't with technology.
There was there's been some nice questions here about what do we do next, and I think let's spend the last sort of 5 to 7 minutes here talking about that, and we might divide them into personal decisions and policy decisions. And one person asked, should we be more consistent and aggressive with the laws? I want to give a caveat and then a little bit of history on this, and then bring Paul in, who can be a little more prescriptive. As a New York Times reporter, I try not to be prescriptive. I try to tell you what people are saying. I'm not an advocate. So with that in mind, first a little history. With drunk driving and with seatbelts, we learned a lot about how to reconcile, to go all the way back to the beginning, behaviors and attitudes. How do we get people first believing drunk driving is a bad idea and then actually changing? That's a pretty good analog here. MAD came along, Candace Lightner. She got people, thinking about human lives and putting faces on it, and then the laws changed. What's interesting here is that in that case, no one ever told you that drinking and driving was a good idea. Now, no one's telling you that using the phone behind the wheel is exactly a good idea, but there's a lot of pressure to stay connected all the time. And so policymakers are saying, is that different than this? Is that the same as this? One other thing that happened with drunk driving is the laws got very tough relatively quickly. Not overnight, to be sure. Let's take nothing away from what Candace Lightner and MAD did and had to fight. But when people think about drunk driving, they are afraid that they're going to kill someone, but they're equally afraid, I bet, if you ask them and if you ask yourself, of being humiliated, going to jail, losing their license, doing the perp walk. None of that is really true of texting and driving. The laws right now don't seem to be making any dent in the behavior, even though the attitudes have changed overwhelmingly. And the answer I've begun to hear from some policymakers and public safety advocates, all the way up to the NTSB, is that there needs to be a full shutdown of phones in the car. Paul, can you speak a little bit to what you think needs to happen from a policy perspective?
Right. The drunk driving example is excellent because as far as my research has shown, the first drunk driving laws went into effect back in, I think the earliest one was New York, 1914. And studies that were done up through the 70s looking at the relationship of attitudes and behaviors basically showed that people knew that drunk driving was dangerous, but because laws weren't in place, they didn't consider it to be a problem. The one that we're interested in, we've actually replicated recently, was one that basically gave people crash scenarios. And in those crash scenarios, there was a drunk driver, and in some of those scenarios, there was a drunk driver plus bad weather. And when there was bad weather, people blamed the bad weather rather than the drunk driver. Fast forward, we've redone that study actually recently, and we gave people those same scenarios. And even when there was bad weather, people blamed the drunk driver for the crash. But here's what's important. We gave people in those scenarios examples not of a drunk driver, but instead, same crash, a texting driver. And we asked, who's most responsible for the crash? People actually said the texting driver was more responsible for the crash than the drunk driver. And in fact, we see that over and over. People say texting is one of the worst things you can do behind the wheel. The funny thing, though, is that when we ask them to punish that person, they still punish the drunk driver more than the texting driver, even when we told them there's a mandatory sentencing law, because laws haven't shifted and attitudes haven't changed. Bottom line, thinking all the way back to Skinner and that little rat, it's easier to change behavior than it is to change attitudes. And we need laws in place that are effective at changing behaviors, and then what will shift later will be the attitudes regarding those particular behaviors. And that's when we see big change. And we're just not quite there yet.
So that's the big policy level. Paul, can you talk a little bit for this audience where there are a lot of people who have companies, and a terrific question here, what about the person who drives for a living, is always in the car? What is the, I know the National Safety Council has a lot of terrific stuff to say on this, and
right.
I would defer to them as a reporter, but Paul, can you speak to what you see with regard to productivity in the phone and how people can make a sound decision in an always on, always moving environment?
Yeah, the National Safety Council has polled its members to ask when you put these bans in place if they affected productivity, and more often than not they see productivity increase than decrease. And we've done some work in our lab where we have people do negotiations while they're driving, and I'll just give the quick bottom line. When someone's negotiating while they're driving, they lose 30% on the deal that they would have gotten if they were just parked using the phone. In other words, because you're using your prefrontal cortex to pay attention to the roadway and all the things that are associated with driving, you don't have as much left over for it to inhibit bad behaviors, to detect the emotions of others, to remember details. And you're, in a sense, having half a conversation. Anyone knows what a driver sounds like. They sound, And so we think we're more productive. We think we're making better decisions. We think we're making a good use of our time. But not only are we unsafe, we're also not doing good work and not being good partners in the workplace or even partners with our families. So
yeah.
In my opinion, there's just no good reason to use a phone while you're driving.
Yeah, there's a question here about hands-free. I think we need to address it in the same way as the passenger. And the graph, I've talked to Dr. Strayer about this graph who put it together. Hands-free, Paul, can you tell us about the kind of neurological demand when people are using a hands-free device and why that is not distraction-free?
Yeah, I mean, probably a lot of people out in the room now, they drive hands-free in a sense that they drive a stick shift and they only use one hand on the wheel at any one time. It's not about manual control. It's about the fact that the most difficult thing that your brain does over the entirety of your life, the one thing that no other organism on this planet can do, unlike us, is listen and talk. It requires so much of your brain to make that work. And when you try to do that task, which is so hard to do, and then stack onto it something else that is difficult and risky, driving loses.
So I'll tell you a story that when I very early on in the reporting of A Deadly Wandering, there was a story of a guy who was traveling across the Golden Gate Bridge just talking on his phone, and he was in his car, and he was ordering Indian food, and someone was coming the other direction. And owing to the wind, the person coming the other direction swerved across the yellow divider, and just narrowly. And in the middle of ordering Indian food, this gentleman did not have the capacity to react. He simply missed the millisecond window while he was switching tasks. And he had not a head-on collision, essentially a semi-head-on collision with the woman driving across the bridge, and she died. And you could argue, well, that was her fault. She came across the yellow divider a few inches. You could argue that it was the wind's fault or no one's fault. But what the neuroscientists have said to me about that case was the mere act of talking on the phone, which the gentleman was doing, made it impossible for him to have that window to react. So taking this all full circle and realizing we're at the last moment, so let me give Paul the last word, but just say this isn't about even the most typical experience when you're driving, when you're with your spouse, when you're trying to concentrate. This isn't about every moment of every day. This is about those moments where someone can live or die, the milliseconds that really matter, that make the difference. 30,000 plus people a year die on the road. This is about those moments. Paul, do you want to just add anything here?
I think your example is a good one, and I think it's good for people to realize when we talk about this problem, saying that a phone causes a crash, well, texting might cause a crash in the sense your eyes aren't on the road and your hands are on the wheel. But if your brain's not engaged with the task, maybe you didn't cause the crash, but you certainly didn't work to prevent it. And I think in that case, you're just as responsible as the person that crossed over that yellow line. It's a risky behavior, and thankfully crashes, relatively speaking, are infrequent. But you can't predict when they're going to happen, and unless you have the attentional capacity to notice it and react, you're just as responsible for that crash as the person that was actually actively causing it.
Paul, it looks to me like everyone's off the call, and we're just talking to ourselves.
Well, thanks, Matt.
Thank you. So we're supposed to stay on, right?
I believe so, yes.
Thank you, Matt Richtel and Dr. Paul Atchley, for presenting today, and thank you to everyone who attended and for all your questions this afternoon. In a couple of days, we will send you a link to the archived recording of this webinar, and shortly you will also receive a brief survey about today's presentation. Please know that your feedback is important to us. The National Safety Council has developed a number of resources to help educate on the risks associated with cell phone use while driving. We welcome you to visit nsc.org/cell/cell-free for a variety of helpful resources, including posters, fact sheets, videos, and more. If this is a topic near to your heart, please consider making a donation at nsc.org/donate. Thank you again for participating in today's webinar, and have a safe day.